Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. I hope all of you are doing great. For those of you who appeared for the prelims examination yesterday, I really hope that all of you checked your answers and you are scoring well above your expectations. If you are scoring anywhere in the 90s or higher than that, our advice would be to not waste any time and start preparing for the upcoming mains examination. Get down to your optional subject, get down to other main subject regarding ethics, etc. Specifically for the mains examination, we are also starting a new initiative on the BYJU'S Exam Prep app, which you can download, where we will be discussing answer writing techniques for static and dynamic portion as well. Also, we are glad to share with you that a lot of questions from yesterday's prelims paper were actually from the topics that we have discussed in the CNAs in the past year or so. Questions such as the T cells and the B cells and how they work in the human body. Questions about the UN clause, the T board of India. All of these are questions which were touched upon in our CNA and in our daily quiz videos. So if you have been watching this over the past year or so, I'm sure all of you would have had an easier examination as compared to some of the other students here. Now, on that note, let's begin the analysis for today's Hindu newspaper. The first article that we have here is about the IPEF, that is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, that was recently announced by the US President when the core leaders were together in Tokyo. Now, the interesting part is that there has not been a lot of details over what exactly would be a part of the IPEF, except a few things which we discussed earlier as well. For example, the governments have announced that the IPEF will focus on four pillars primarily: fair and resilient trade, supply chain resiliency, clean energy decarbonization, and tax and anti corruption. Now, the countries have been very, very specific in saying that the IPEF is not a free trade agreement. So, it is not that the member nations are coming together to reduce their tariffs, etc. It is more about building trade and economics communication and good relations on that aspect. The aim of this particular organization would also be to build much more resilient supply chains. Now, as you know, with the COVID 19 pandemic hitting the entire world, the world's supply chains, specifically because they have been tied down with China, had a major impact. And that is why a lot of companies and nations around the world are hoping that there might be some alternative towards companies that want to shift from China to some other nations. And that is also one of the initiatives that the IPEF is taking. The reason why it is in the news today is that IPEF has now expanded to the Pacific Ocean, with Fiji also joining it, which was not the original member of IPEF when it was announced in Tokyo. The US government seems to be working very, very eagerly in this regard. Now, the author here is making a point that the US, in the past decade or so, in fact, has been trying to come up with new ideas in terms of trade agreements to counter the spread and the growing influence of China. When Barack Obama was a president, we saw the rise of TPP, Trans Pacific Partnership, which was a brainchild of the US, and it was said to be one of the largest free trade agreements in the entire world. But we also that when Donald Trump came to power as a US president, he withdrew from the TPP. So America's own idea was left alone and America decided to stay out of it. Donald Trump, on the other hand, was in favor of signing individual trade agreements rather than joining a group. Now, Joe Biden, who belongs to a different political party, that is the Democrats, now wants to go the Barack Obama way by introducing another initiative in the form of IPEF, which many people say is similar to the Trans Pacific Partnership, just that it is not a free trade agreement as such. Also, if you look at the document of the IPEF, you will see that there are a lot of important points. However, there are some points which are missing as well. For example, US has always been very adamant that whenever they sign such an agreement, it should have a mention of the IPR, the intellectual property rights. This is a concern with most of the developed nations who believe that when their technology goes to a developing country, it is not protected and it gets copied, and the developing governments don't take enough efforts to safeguard this kind of technology which is patented or has a copyright. Interestingly, the IPRs have not been mentioned as a part of the IPEF, and there can be multiple reasons behind that. In the past few years, we have seen a lot of criticism of IPR, especially in the field of pharmaceuticals. In fact, it is because most of the COVID vaccines have been patented, that is why even today, only 16.2% people in the low income countries across the world have got at least one COVID vaccine. Because we still have a lot of people in the world that still cannot afford the COVID vaccine because they are patented and they are not really cheap. Thus, the pharma companies especially want IPRs to be a part of such agreements, but thankfully, it is not a part of the IPEF at least till now. On the other hand, the two issues which have been made a part of the IPEF are the labor rights and environment and climate change. Now, this is where there is some confusion because the WTO specifically says that you cannot enforce labor rights using trade rules. The labor rights are separate and they would have to be as per the domestic law of the country and as per the ILO conventions. WTO, in fact, in the past has struck down multiple agreements in which the countries have tried to impose certain labor rights. Also, in terms of environment and climate change, the UNFCCC has also made a similar kind of observation. The UNFCCC has mentioned in the past that measures taken to combat climate change, including unilateral ones, should not constitute an arbitrary and unjustifiable discrimination. Meaning that trade and the concept of climate change should be separate, it should not impact each other. Also, just because you have to fight climate change, it should not result in restriction on international trade. So both these points of labor rights and environment and climate change mentioned in the IPEF seems to be contrary to what the global world order is. The third issue with IPEF, specifically with respect to India, is that it mentions the concept of data portability. Now, as you know, data is the most important thing in the world right now. Whoever controls most of the data would have most of the information and would be the most powerful corporation in the entire world. That is why the internet corporations, the e-commerce websites are so powerful because they have a lot of data about you. Now, the IPEF mentions the concept of data portability, meaning that the data that is stored in India should be applicable or should be able to be transferred to other countries who are a part of the IPEF. So there should be much more data sharing. This is where there is a concern amongst a lot of nations. For example, as you know, India has been trying to ensure that there is a law of data localization. That is, we want that data stored by these big companies, be it Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, etc., should be stored within our country. So if WhatsApp has some data of Indian citizens, it should be stored in India so that the Indian laws can apply to it, which is not really the case right now. We have still not made a clear-cut stand on this as to where do we stand with respect to data portability in the IPEF. There is one more concern here. These countries which are a part of the IPEF are projecting it to make an alternative as compared to China. They are asking the other companies, if you want to shift your base from China, we will provide you a much better environment in other nations. But that is not that simple. Hundreds and thousands of companies, even from the US, have set up their base in China since the 1990s, and their business has been going well. Even all through the pandemic, there were talks that these companies would want to shift their bases, but as soon as the pandemic situation became better, most of them came back to China only. So it would not be that easy. Also, if the US is aiming to ensure that these supply chains become more resilient, what is the guarantee that if these companies shift from China to some other nation, that the supply chains will become more resilient? Because this issue will still remain. And that is why the IPEF is still just an idea on paper with a lot more details that would need to be discussed in the coming days. This is the graph that shows you all the member nations of the IPEF, excluding Fiji, which has just joined. So these are the 13 nations and China. So China is not a part of the IPEF. Apart from China, the other 13 nations that you see here are the part of IPEF, including India, Malaysia, Thailand, US, New Zealand, Australia, Indonesia, Philippines, Japan, South Korea, etc. As I said earlier, the IPEF has one of its goals to improve the supply chain resilience. Now, whenever any of these trade agreements or any of these agreements are signed, they never specifically say that we are against China. They never specifically say that we are trying to curb the influence of China. But that is implied with most of these. It was implied with the Trans-Pacific Partnership as well. It is implied with the IPEF as well. The interesting part is that in the past decade or so, while the Western nations have not been able to take such steps to control the rise of China, China, on the other hand, has been expanding at a great pace. For example, China is a part of the RCEP. China has also initiated other kind of platforms such as the AIIB. It is also an integral part of the SCO. So while China is successfully forging these partnerships and taking advantage of these, the Western nations have still not been able to give a run for its money to China. Thus, the IPEF, which is now coming up, seems to be another attempt by the Western nations, hopefully, to control the rise of China. As I said earlier, and as I said by these countries specifically, this is not a free trade agreement. Now, this is where the problem lies. See, WTO says that if two nations or a group of nations have a free trade agreement, then it is fine. They can give preferential treatment to each other's products. But now that IPEF is not a free trade agreement officially, would the nations be allowed to treat each other's products with any preference or not? That is still something that remains to be seen. Because most probably, if that happens, there would be some objections raised at the WTO. On the other hand, if it does turn into a free trade agreement, it will majorly be driven by the interests of the United Nations and may become just a free trade agreement of these nations with the US. So the future of this remains to be seen depending upon how these countries negotiate with each other. At the launch ceremony of the IPEF, Prime Minister Modi said that we have to ensure three T's: trust, transparency, and the time to ensure that this IPEF platform becomes a success. Now that most of you are appearing and planning for the mains examination, just to give you an idea, when you are writing answers in the mains examination, you can always quote these kind of things. That Prime Minister Modi came up with the idea of the three T's at the launch event of the IPEF. So these kind of answers and these kind of quotes will fetch you good marks if you want to inculcate this in your answer writing. The next article that we have here is a very interesting article in the sense that if you don't read the name of the author, if you just read the article, you would imagine that this is written by a Congress leader or a person who is against the ruling party. Because the entire article is based on this idea that the economic policies of the government right now are a failure. Their promises of economic development are very far away from the policies that they have been following. But then in the end, if you actually see the person who has written this article, you will be surprised. He has been a BJP member for a long time. And he has been against the Congress also for even longer. This is Mr. Subramaniam Swamy, one of the youngest people to pursue PhD from Harvard. He was also a professor in Harvard and has always been giving a lot of radical views about Indian economy. Now, as you know, recently, the GDP results for the fourth quarter of the last financial year came out and it showed that the GDP growth was 4.1%. Now, if you take the entire year, you would see that the GDP growth that we had was actually negative of 4.8% in 2020-21. Now, these numbers that have actually come out indicate towards the fact that the Indian economy is not really improving at a pace that the government of India may be claiming. In fact, the author here is saying that this has been the trend in the past few years. So much so that this trend of decline has been seen since 2016, means much before even the pandemic hit. So we cannot blame it all on the COVID-19 pandemic. He says that the tall promises made by the government of achieving the $5 trillion GDP mark by 2024-25 needed that since 2019 we should have had a growth rate of close to 15%, which is nowhere the case because we in fact had a negative growth rate in the pandemic year. So we are very far away from the target. The author here gives an example of the reforms that were introduced by P.V. Narasimha Rao when he was a Prime Minister. It was during his tenure as a Prime Minister that India introduced a 1991 LPG reforms budget, which is remembered even today. He says that these kind of reforms now are needed if we have to ensure that our economy becomes much more robust. The author here says that if the government does not start focusing on the economy, very soon they will see these results in the election as well. We have seen this in the previous governments as well. In 2004, the Atal Bihari Vajpayee government gave the slogan of India Shining. They were so confident that they will win the election that they had actually preponed the election. But to the surprise of everyone, including the Congress, the BJP actually lost the elections. And the same, he says, may happen here if we do not take drastic steps, because the situation right now in the country in terms of economy is not great. And we have to understand that whenever there's an economic decline, the political instability is always around the corner. So, if the government wants to ensure that the country remains politically stable, they have to focus on the economy. They have to introduce drastic reforms, give much more freedom to trade, give much more freedom to the market with certain strict rules. Mr. Subramanian Swamy has always been in favor of introducing capitalism with certain strict rules that should be followed by every single one. Now, this is what he has been talking about. That is, India's growth has been on a downhill since 2016. If you see, since 2016, the growth numbers have come down considerably. 2017 was about 6.5, 2018 even lower, 2019 about 4%, in 2020 we all saw that it went to the negative percentage point. And that is why we have to be wary of where we are heading as per Dr. Subramaniam Swamy. Now, since he is a very learned person, especially in the field of economics, he has actually given a lot of drastic ideas to ensure that our economy becomes much better. One of the most drastic ideas that he had actually given was that India should actually abolish income tax altogether. Now, abolishing income tax altogether does not really mean that you would not have to pay any tax. This means that you have to pay tax on consumption. So, if you're buying something, for example, then apart from GST, you'll have to pay one more tax, or a component of the GST may be taken as the income tax. But there would not be any tax on just the salary that you are getting. These kind of radical ideas, in fact, have been proposed by other people as well. And they have done a lot of research behind such kind of an ideas, but as expected, this has not been taken up by the government. The article here also mentions a phrase called the Hindu rate of growth, which has been mentioned at many places. I'm sure many of you would be familiar with this. Just to refresh your memory, the Hindu rate of growth basically is the slow rate of growth that India showed in 1970s and 1980s, around 3 to 3.5%, which was almost consistent. That came to be known as the Hindu rate of growth. It was a phrase coined by Professor Raj Krishna. A lot of people don't agree with this. A lot of people, in fact, think that it is derogatory, but this is a phrase that has just stuck with India. This phrase was used to highlight the problems with the socialistic economic policies that were being followed in India in 1970s and 80s that led to such a slow growth rate in the entire country. Do understand, the word Hindu here does not have to do anything with religion, it does just have to do with socialism. The next article that we have here is on a very interesting topic. He is saying that in democracies across the world, be it India, be it US, there is a one very clear pattern that we are seeing. The pattern is that the representatives of the people, the parliament and the other people who are in power, and even the judiciary, they are not really in line with what the people actually demand or what people actually need. A lot of decisions taken by the parliament and the judges are just not in line with the aspirations of the people around the world. And here the author is giving examples of both India and the US. We saw what is happening in US. There are a couple of examples. One example that we have discussed earlier also, that a draft has been leaked from the US Supreme Court under which the judges are favoring banning abortion in the US. Now this has led to a big debate in the US because it is assumed by multiple surveys that a majority, in fact a vast majority of the US population favors abortion. The second example is that there has recently been another very unfortunate mass shooting in the US in a primary school where small children and their teachers were killed. This again led to a demand that there should be a control on the gun culture in the US, because in the US it is very easy for almost anyone to go and buy a gun. Despite multiple such mass shootings, the parliament has just not been able to pass this kind of a law because a gun lobby in the US led by the NRA, National Rifles Association, is very strong. This again goes against the aspirations of the majority of the people. Majority of the people in the US are of the view that it should be much more difficult to buy guns and carry them, but the parliament has just not been passing the law for this. The judiciary also has not intervened in this matter because they say it is the parliament's job to make such a law. These are examples to highlight that whatever the majority of the people think are not the laws which are actually being passed by the representatives. Similarly, you can see what is happening in India. We recently had a controversial law about citizenship passed recently. We have the old law on sedition, most of which are actually opposed by a lot of people in the country, but still these laws have been passed, they have been challenged in the court, but even the court is not finding enough time to hear appeals about this. Take an example of the Citizenship Amendment Act that was passed even before the pandemic. The matter about this act is still pending in the Supreme Court, but it has just not been heard. So, this is a common thread amongst most of the democracies, as per the author. That yes, people do choose the representatives that they want, but the representatives at the end of the day end up making or not making the laws that the people actually want. The same is seen in case of the judiciary as well. So, what is the solution? The solution is, as per the author, that the people must raise their voice. If they want their representatives to listen to them, the people themselves will have to find a consensus. And in this aspect also, the one thing that the people must do is listen to others as well whose point of view is not the same as yours. Only and only then they will be able to come out with a consensus and put pressure on the government by various ways. Maybe by acting as a pressure group, or maybe by taking part in electoral politics themselves. But in democracies around the world, the voters will have to make their voices heard. Yes, the citizens have the right in democracies, but they also have the responsibility. The responsibility is to speak against the government. The responsibility is to make their voices heard. Because if that doesn't happen, the people in the position of power will have a free hand and you won't be able to ask them to take responsibility of their actions. The article here mentions a very interesting theorem called the Arrow's impossibility theorem. It's a very famous theorem amongst those who actually study political science in detail. This is a theorem written by a very famous professor at Harvard and Stanford. In simple terms, this theorem says that whenever the elections are actually happening in a democracy, there are so many people who are voting that it is impossible that the elections will be fair. The theorem says that in the results of the election, it is impossible that these five things will not be violated. One of these five things will always be violated whenever we have election in a democracy. For example, either the people's choice will not be taken into consideration, or maybe the more popular candidate will not win, or maybe if one of the candidates out of the multiple candidate drops out, it will change the rankings of others. Maybe the voting account of all the individual preferences would not be kept. Something or the other in all these five, as per the theorem, will not be followed in a democracy. And this is not just a random theorem, it actually has been proven by seeing examples of multiple elections around the world. And that is how the theorem has been defined. That whenever there is an election in a big democracy, there will be something or the other that will go wrong and it will not be as per the law. This is called Arrow's impossibility theorem. The next article that we have here is about a very interesting machine called the eVTOL or eVTOL. This stands for Electric Vehicle Takeoff and Landing Aircraft. In very simple terms, if I have to define you in very layman language, that would be helicopters which are actually running on electric energy. Simple. Now, if you think of it, why were the helicopters introduced when we always had aircrafts? The reason why helicopters were introduced actually were, number one, they don't require a runway. So if you actually read about aircrafts, you will see that number one, most of the aircraft accidents happen on the runway while taking off or while landing. Secondly, the reason why it is not easy to make airports, or the reason why it is not easy to expand an airport, is that it is very difficult to find such a big space where big runways can be made. The bigger the aircraft, the bigger the runways that they require. That is why in a lot of smaller cities we still don't have airports, because we don't have the kind of land that is required, the kind of connectivity that is required. That is where the helicopters came into being, because they can take off and they can land vertically. They don't really need a runway. Now, this is what the electric aircrafts or the eVTOL will do. They will operate as helicopters, so they don't require a runway. They can take off and land vertically and using electrical batteries. The reason that it is in the news is that the Union Civil Aviation Minister has said that the government of India is exploring the possibility of inviting the manufacturers of these eVTOLs to set up their base in India. Now, there are certain companies across the world which are running in this field and they have made certain prototypes, and a lot of people are excited about this technology. The reason being, as I said, you don't require a lot of infrastructure like building of runways, etc. And electric power also helps because it will be noiseless, it will be very environmental friendly, and if the technology expands, it will also be much, much more affordable as compared to the aircrafts that we have. This can also take the form of urban taxis where people are living in a very, very congested population. But a lot of work still has to be done in this particular regard. In fact, the eVTOLs have been called as a third wave in aerial revolution. The first wave being commercial flying, second being the helicopters, and third being these eVTOLs. As with most of the electric vehicles, they are also working with the lithium ion batteries, hoping that these batteries will give them the kind of power that they need. These aircrafts will especially need power at the time of landing and at the time of taking off, especially when they are in bad weather, heavy winds, etc. The other problem that we have with these aircraft which they are working on is that since they are using a lot more technology, they can also be prone to cyber attacks because some of these aircraft may also be built to work without a pilot as a drone, as an autonomous machine, which can be very, very prone to cyber attacks. Also, how would they behave in difficult terrains, unsafe environments, bad weather, etc. also has to be seen. Not just new age startups, but old and well established companies such as Boeing and Airbus have also been looking into this idea, and they have also launched their prototypes, and the entire world is very, very excited to see them. These are some of the details of the design. Now, depending on the companies, the design will be different, but these are mainly the designs that you will see for the eVTOLs. So they will be a luggage hold. As you can see, these are not very big aircraft. So it has a sitting capacity of, let's say, 4 along with the pilot. The size may increase to 6 or maybe 8 people, but this is it. It will not have a very, very large capacity. So it will mostly be about air taxi. It will mostly be about private travel for shorter distances. Now, as you saw in the name, it says eVTOL. VTOL here stands for vertical takeoff and landing. So in the field of aviation, you would see that there are different types of landings and takeoff techniques depending upon the infrastructure and the kind of aircraft that we had. We have the CTOL, which is the conventional takeoff and landing, that is the commercial planes that you see. We have the STOL, that is a short takeoff and landing. STOVL, that is the short takeoff and vertical landing. So for landing, you don't really require a runway, but for takeoff, you require a very, very short runway. Then there are helicopters, which we have all seen, functioning as vertical takeoff and landing. If this technology is successful, it will bring a huge revolution in terms of personal transportation and in terms of urban air transportation as well. And it will take away the requirement of building this huge infrastructure for setting up air transportation. The next article that we have here is a news that we are all aware of, but even then, whenever it comes out, it is actually a very, very big shock. That is, all the rivers across the country are facing huge pollution. In fact, as per a report published recently by an NGO called the Center for Science and Environment, 3/4 of rivers in India are actually facing alarming levels of heavy toxic metals that include lead, iron, nickel, cadmium, arsenic, chromium, copper. Many of these are in fact carcinogenic in nature. They may even cause cancer. The sad part is that India dumps about 3/4, 72% of our sewage without any treatment in these rivers. Just imagine the sewage water, that is the waste water that goes out of your house, from your bathroom, they can be from your kitchen, they can be from other sources. When it goes out, it is sewage. Imagine 3/4 of that is not being treated, is still just being dumped into the rivers. The same river where you might go and take a bath, the same river where you might go and undertake water activities. That waste is just not being treated and going away. In fact, in 10 states across the country, there is no treatment of sewage at all. Such is the situation in India. This has also resulted in shoreline erosion at many places in the country, with West Bengal being the worst hit state, where erosion is seen in the highest order on their shorelines. There are some other reasons responsible for this erosion in the shoreline, including the increased frequency of cyclones, rising sea levels, etc. But yes, the anthropogenic activities, that is human-made reasons, are also big reasons for that. Now, this is one of those topics that have a very high probability of being asked in the examination in GS3 paper. That is why it is important for us to be updated about the current facts and the numbers on this particular topic. A few months back, the CPCB, that is the Central Pollution Control Board, actually came out with a report which talked a lot about the sewage treatment plants in India and highlighted some very problematic things. It said that 3/4 of India's sewage is not being treated. India only has a capacity of treating about 1/4 of the sewage. And many of the states in India, like Arunachal Pradesh, Lakshadweep, Andaman Nicobar, Manipur, Meghalaya, don't even have any sewage plants that are installed. The only one ray of hope that we have is Chandigarh, that is treating the entire sewage that is generated in the city. Because it is a planned city, that is why they had planned for it when the city was being developed. Now, we also have to understand that the sewage treatment can also be a great opportunity for us if we take it up in the correct manner. Like a lot of water that is treated from the sewage can be reused for a lot of activities, which is happening in Haryana, Puducherry, Delhi, and Chandigarh also. This treated water from the sewage can be used for horticulture, irrigation, washing activities like washing vehicles, trains, etc., even in firefighting, toilet flushing, gardening, etc. That means that it will reduce the load of water from rivers, ponds, lakes, and groundwater as well. Then the question is, why are we not doing more of it? There are a lot of roadblocks. For example, with increasing population, with increasing urbanization, the amount of sewage that is created every single day is increasing. So no amount of facilities that we have right now can be enough. Secondly, it is not economically very cheap to set up such kind of sewage treatment plants. Not just setting them up, because there are a lot of sewage treatment plants that do exist but they're just not being run properly. So setting these up and then making sure that they are running and being maintained according to the specialized techniques that are in the market, that is also something that has to be done. The big reason is that on the list of priorities for the government, this might not seem to be right there at the top, and that is why it is being ignored till a later day when the situation becomes even far worse. These are the topics we want to discuss from the Hindu newspaper today. Now, a couple of practice questions. Number one, evaluate the current status of sewage treatment in India. Why are we still lagging far behind in treating majority of sewage produced in India? Second, India should ensure that the newly envisioned IPEF is more pro-India than anti-China. Discuss. Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. As you know, you can write answers to these questions and post on our BYJU'S IAS portal, the link for which is given in the description of the video. You can see each other's answers, check them, give feedback, and learn from each other's mistake now that the mains is the next stage of the examination. Thank you so much for watching the video. Have a good day ahead.